year 400, St. Augustine wrote a 4-volume work called The Harmony of the Gospels. In it, he sought to show that the 4 Gospels can be harmonized with each other and that they don't contradict each other. In the course of writing the work, St. Augustine proposed that Mark was the second Gospel to be written and that it was basically an abridgment of Matthew. Luke then wrote third, and finally John wrote last. This idea became known as the Augustinian hypothesis after St. Augustine, and it was very popular for many centuries. Despite its historical popularity, though, there are several reasons to think that it's incorrect. Let's get into it. Howdy, folks. We're in our second year of the podcast now, and you can help me keep making this podcast for years to come and get yourself early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. In the Harmony of the Gospels, St. Augustine wrote, Mark follows Matthew closely and looks like his attendant and epitomizer. For in his narrative, he gives nothing in concert with John apart from the others. By himself separately, he has little to record. In conjunction with Luke, as distinguished from the rest, he has still less. But in concord with Matthew, he has a very large number of passages. Much, too, he narrates in words almost numerically and identically the same as those used by Matthew, where the agreement is either with that evangelist alone or with him in connection with the rest. Augustine thus argued that Matthew followed Mark, saying he was his attendant, and that he shortened Matthew, saying that he was his epitomizer. He therefore offers 2 arguments for his proposal. First, that Mark has a great deal of material in common with Matthew, compared to Luke and John, and second, that Mark's wording is very similar to that of Matthew, compared to Luke and John. It's quite true that Mark's Gospel has a great deal in common with Matthew's Gospel. It's commonly estimated that 90% of the material found in Mark is also found in Matthew. 9 out of 10 verses in Mark are paralleled in Matthew. There are more parallels between Mark and Matthew than in any other 2 pairings of the Gospels, so there does seem to be a special relationship between the 2. Augustine could be correct, then, that Mark took Matthew's Gospel and abridged it, but it could also be the other way around. Matthew could have taken Mark's Gospel, used 9/10 of it, and then added traditions from other sources to expand it. This is what's known as a reversible argument. You could argue from the parallels between the 2 Gospels that Mark used Matthew, but you could also argue that Matthew used Mark. The argument thus can be reversed and go either way. This is true of many of the arguments concerning the synoptic problem, that is, the question of how Matthew, Mark, and Luke are related. See episode 57 for an introduction to the synoptic problem. Reversible arguments are inconclusive. Either gospel could be used in the other, so more evidence is needed to decide the question. A problem for Augustine's argument based on the similarity of language is that even if he's right that Mark's language is most similar to Matthew's, this is also a reversible argument. To account for the similarity, Mark could have borrowed language from Matthew, but Matthew could also have borrowed language from Mark. Again, it can go either way. Just as before, Mark could have used Matthew, or Matthew could have used Mark, so we need to look for more evidence. Some have argued that if the Apostle Matthew was the author of the Gospel that bears his name, then he would have been unlikely to use the Gospel of Mark as a source. It's pointed out that, Matthew was an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry, whereas Mark was not. Would an eyewitness really base his Gospel on one written by a non-eyewitness? Some have suggested that the answer is no, he wouldn't be likely to do that. Therefore, since there is a relationship between Matthew's and Mark's Gospels, this relationship is better explained if Mark, the non-eyewitness, used Matthew's Gospel rather than the other way around. How good is this argument? You could challenge it by arguing that Matthew didn't write the Gospel attributed to him, but I support the traditional authorship view, so I don't have an interest in going that route. I do, however, think the argument is open to serious critique. First, each of the Gospels uses material that the author was not an eyewitness of. None of them are simply memoirs of what someone experienced when they were with Jesus. This demonstrates that the evangelists were not averse to describing events that they did not witness and for which they had to rely on sources. Second, Matthew's Gospel indicates that he was not among Jesus' first disciples. That group was recruited in chapter 4 of Matthew, but Matthew himself doesn't appear until chapter 9. While Matthew likely heard the content of the Sermon on the Mount multiple times during his time with Jesus, he is dependent on others for what happened before he joined Jesus' band of disciples. Third, the issue is not whether a text was written by an eyewitness, but whether it's accurate. If Matthew thought that Mark's Gospel was accurate, then he could use it as a source, whether it was written by an eyewitness or not. Indeed, he could have found that Mark corresponded well to his own memories of Jesus' ministry and used it as a source. Fourth, the earliest evidence we have, evidence that dates from the first century figure known as John the Presbyter, who may or may not be the same as John the Apostle, indicates that Mark was based on the preaching of Peter, and Peter was an eyewitness. Indeed, Peter was an even more authoritative eyewitness than Matthew. He was also one of Jesus' first disciples and had been with Jesus longer than Matthew. The view that Mark's Gospel was based on Peter's preaching was present in the first century, and for precisely this reason, Matthew might have chosen to use it as one of his sources. Furthermore, according to Acts, Peter and Matthew seem to have spent more than a decade living and preaching in Jerusalem after the ministry of Jesus. Matthew thus would have heard Peter's preaching on many occasions and would have been able to recognize that Mark was an accurate record of it. I can also speak from my own experience here. In the ancient pre-copyright age, authors borrowed much more freely from each other than they do today. This was particularly so in anonymous works, which both Matthew and Mark's Gospels were, at least in the sense that their names are not recorded in the text of the two Gospels. The issue of anonymity is actually more complex than that, and I'll discuss it in a future episode. But if Matthew came across Mark's Gospel and realized that it presented the core of the story of Jesus in much the same way that he would present it, then he would have been inclined to use it as a labor-saving means. I mean, why reinvent the wheel? Why not use what's already there, supplement it, and polish it? This is an experience I've had many times. For over 30 years, I've worked at Catholic Answers, a religious education ministry that publishes a lot of resources, often without bylines. In this informal, collaborative environment, I have had the occasion many times to take a text originally written by someone else, apply it to a new purpose, and modify it accordingly. I don't do that for books, articles, or blog posts that are meant to be copyrighted and published under my name. Modern rules about copyright and plagiarism apply to those. But there is another class of materials the ministry publishes without a byline or that are attributed to staff, where those rules don't apply and different internal authors may freely borrow from one another. If I were producing such a text and a prior text was available that did much of what I wanted the new text to do, I wouldn't hesitate to use its language, extracting, expanding, abridging, and editing it to fit the new purpose I had in mind. This environment is much like the one that seemed to have prevailed among the synoptic evangelists, where they were all united in the common purpose of telling the story of Jesus, and questions of authorial ownership of their texts were secondary. Since Matthew was not producing a memoir but a biography, he was willing to use sources to describe things that he didn't see. Given that, he likely would have been willing to use sources to describe the things he did see, rather than insisting on deliberately starting from scratch to describe them and reduplicating all of that effort. Based on my own experience, I have no difficulty imagining Matthew taking Mark's Gospel in hand and saying, This does much of what I want. I'll use it as a base text and expand and modify it to suit the purposes I want to fulfill in my own gospel. There's also another reason that Matthew could feel free to use the text of Mark. In Gospels Before the Book, Matthew Larson argues that Mark was not intended to be a finished book on its own. In the ancient world, there was a genre of literature known in Greek as Hupomnemata and in Latin as Commentarii. These were basically quick, unpolished collections of notes on a subject, not finished, polished literary works. Sometimes these unpolished note collections were published. For example, Julius Caesar published his Gallic War as a set of Commentarii. And sometimes Hupomnemata or Commentarii were used as the basis on which to compose a later, more polished work. Sometimes the later author would be the same person as the one who initially wrote the Hupomnemata, and sometimes they'd be a different individual. In fact, Hupomnemata were sometimes sold to another author as the basis for composing a later, more polished work. We don't have any evidence of a financial transaction like that among the authors of the Synoptic Gospels, but Mark does look remarkably like a set of Hupomnemata. It has an unpolished literary style, and it leaves out things that we would expect an ordinary biography of Jesus to include, like an infancy narrative and accounts of his resurrection appearances. If Mark were an unpolished, unfinished collection of notes, that would explain these facts. And it looks like Matthew and Luke both used Mark exactly as Hupomnemata were commonly used, as a base text that they used in composing their own more finished, polished Gospels. If Mark was a set of unpolished notes that could be used to compose later, more finished works, that would be an extra reason that Matthew would have felt free to use it when composing his own gospel. The argument that Matthew simply would not have used Mark, this strikes me as very weak. Augustine said that Mark follows Matthew closely and looks like his attendant and epitomizer. Many moderns could be puzzled by the meaning of this because, for us, the term epitome is usually understood to mean an outstanding example of something, like if someone said, George is the epitome of a Southern gentleman. But in the ancient world, an epitome was something else. It was a shortened version of a literary work, something like the Reader's Digest condensed books that were popular some time ago. If you're too young to remember those, then think of the book summaries published by Cliff Notes and Spark Notes, though those aren't as close a parallel. Epitomes allowed ancient readers to get the gist of a work of literature without having to read or purchase the whole thing, which was extremely expensive given the ancient cost of producing books by hand. A single copy of what we would consider a very short book cost the equivalent of several $1,000s, so there was price pressure to create shorter summaries of books for those who couldn't afford the full-length versions. By saying that Mark looks like Matthew's Epitomizer, Augustine means that Mark appears to have made a condensed version of Matthew, or an epitome. The idea that Mark is an epitome of Matthew opens a new way to shed light on our question, because it allows us to ask, if Mark is an epitome of Matthew, does it fit the model of other ancient epitomes? If Mark works like other ancient epitomes, that would strengthen Augustine's case. On the other hand, if Mark doesn't work like other ancient epitomes, then it would weaken his case. Mark does look like an epitome of Matthew in two respects. First, it is shorter than the original. Mark is shorter than Matthew. Two, it parallels much of the substance of the original rather than just a part or a few parts of it. In every other way, though, Mark does not look like an epitome of Matthew. This is perhaps why Augustine used cautious language, saying that Mark looks like Matthew's epitomizer rather than fully asserting it. Augustine may realize that Mark didn't fit the model of other ancient epitomes. In 2001, Robert Derenbacher published a fascinating doctoral thesis titled Ancient Compositional Practices and the Synoptic Problem. In the show notes or video description, we'll have a link to where you can read it online for yourself. It contains a very helpful discussion of ancient epitomes and how they worked. One of the things that Derenbacher brings out is the fact that ancient epitomes tended to be abridgments of much longer works. For example, Second Maccabees is an abridgment of a 5-volume history by Jason of Cyrene. This means that Second Maccabees, which originally fit on a single scroll, was a condensation of a work that originally filled 5 scrolls. Another thing Derenbacher brings out is that ancient epitomizers didn't just shorten works. I mean, that's something they could have done just by deleting sections of the longer work. Instead, they also tightened up the individual sections or pericopes of the work. Thus, in the case of a historical or biographical epitome, they would recount incidents found in the original book, but use fewer words to tell the same story. This was one of their key tools in making the epitome shorter than the original, since it allowed them to save space without losing substance. You'd still get the same story, even if it's told in fewer words. When we compare the Gospel of Mark with the kind of epitomes used in the ancient world, we find that it's dramatically different on both of the counts just mentioned. Matthew has 18,345 words in the Greek New Testament, while Mark has 11,304. This means that Matthew is only 1.6 times as long as Mark, or put it another way, Mark is 62% as long as Matthew. Contrast that to the original work of Jason of Cyrene, which was at least 5 times longer than Second Maccabees. So Second Maccabees was only 20% as long as the original it was based on. Furthermore, Matthew was itself a fairly short work that could fit on a single scroll. Given its word count, it could be read aloud in less than 2 hours. Matthew was thus not the kind of work that called for an epitome. It was too short for that. And it certainly didn't call for an epitome that was 62% the length of the original. That's not a great deal of space savings, and so there wouldn't have been a great deal of cost savings or a great deal of demand for such a work. Another striking way in which Mark does not look like an epitome of Matthew is the fact that the individual pericopes or sections in Mark don't tend to be shorter than the parallels in Matthew. Instead, it's the opposite. They're longer, sometimes much longer. B.H. Streeter writes, for example, the number of words employed by Mark to tell the stories of the Gadarene demoniac, Jairus' daughter, and the feeding of the 5,000 are respectively 325, 374, and 235. Matthew contrives to tell them in 136, 135, and 157 words. So Mark typically uses a lot more words to tell a given story about Jesus than Matthew does, but that is not what ancient epitomizers did. They tended to tighten up stories and use fewer words to recount them because this was a key tool in making an epitome. It allowed the author to save space while retaining substance. The fact that Mark does the opposite would make him unlike any other epitomizer in the ancient world, and thus we have evidence that he wasn't epitomizing. Instead, the fact that Matthew uses fewer words to tell the same stories as Mark suggests that Matthew was producing an expanded edition of Mark, keeping 90% of the substance, but tightening up the stories to make room for all the additional material he wanted to include in his gospel. This brings us to the question of the editorial choices that the evangelist made about what material to include. If Mark is an epitome of Matthew, then we must ask the question of why he omitted the parts of Matthew that he did. Doing so surely saved space, but he could have achieved the same goal by omitting other parts of Matthew. So why did he skip those particular passages that he did? In an article on my website that we'll have a link to in the show notes or video description, we'll have a list of 61 pericopes that Mark would have had to omit from Matthew if he were epitomizing him. These would be passages that Mark chose to omit entirely, not just shorten, which is what epitomizers normally did. These would be passages that Mark chose to omit in their entirety. So once again, Mark would not be acting like a normal ancient epitomizer. But we still have to ask why Mark would have omitted these sections of Matthew. You can imagine Mark omitting material that he considered less important, but that doesn't describe much of the material on this list. Mark would have deleted everything concerning the genealogy, birth, and early life of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, and most of Jesus' parables, as well as other notable passages. While we might suppose that he would omit some of these items for space reason, others are simply too important in contrast to what Mark retained to suppose that this is the answer. I mean, for example, is the Lord's Prayer, which he would have deliberately omitted, really less important than the healing of the man with the withered hand, which he would have retained? On the epitome hypothesis, Mark didn't just omit material from Matthew. He also added new material of his own. Here's a list of 11 sections I identified Mark as including that are not found in Matthew. If Mark were epitomizing Matthew, we wouldn't expect him to include any of these pericopes, because the point of an epitome is to produce a shorter version of a much longer work. Introducing new material that's going to lengthen your own work is contrary to the purpose of an epitome. So Mark would once again not be acting like an ancient epitomizer. But apart from that, we'd still need to ask why Mark chose to include these specific pericopes compared to those he omitted. Is the material in them of sufficient value to warrant omitting much of the material that he would have had to exclude? I mean, is the Lord's Prayer really less important than Mark's note about Jesus' departing Capernaum, or his family hearing about what happened with Jesus before they show up? Is it worth omitting the bulk of Jesus' teachings as found in Matthew in order to add material that largely concerns additional stories about healing and exorcism that duplicate other similar stories? By contrast, if Matthew used Mark, given the minor importance and largely reduplicative nature of this material, it's easy to see how Matthew could have omitted these pericopes in the interests of space, so he could add all the material about Jesus' teachings rather than doing it the other way around. One of the things that Derenbacher brings out in his discussion of epitomes is that they tended to replace the works that they abridged. Very often, the epitome was more popular than the original, and so more copies of it were made than the original. This allowed the epitome to survive the ages while the original long work got lost. That's why we still have Second Maccabees today, but Jason of Cyrene's original 5-volume history is lost. The reason for this phenomenon is that epitomes were of more value to the ancient audience than the original. This was a case of less is more. The epitomes took much less time to read and absorb, while still allowing the reader to get the gist of the original, and being shorter, they were much cheaper in an age in which books had to be handwritten. But what value did Mark think he would be adding for the reader by producing an epitome of Matthew? He wasn't giving them extra value in terms of dramatic space savings, since Mark is 62% as long as Matthew, which fits on a single scroll anyway. And Mark wasn't giving them extra value in terms of new material, which we wouldn't expect an epitomizer to include anyway. The handful of minor reduplicative stories that he would have added would scarcely offset the loss of the huge bulk of valuable material in Matthew that Mark would have had to set aside. This lack of added value, both in terms of space and content, would have set Mark up to be an unsuccessful epitome. In fact, Mark's gospel was by far the least popular of the 4 gospels in the early church. One of the ways we know that is by counting the number of early manuscripts of the Gospels that have survived. In his book, The Earliest Christian Artifacts, Larry Hurtado gives a list of the gospel manuscripts that were available at the time his book was published and that date from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. There were 12 manuscripts of Matthew, 7 manuscripts of Luke, 16 manuscripts of John, but only 1 of Mark. The fact that so few manuscripts of Mark have survived from this period compared to the others suggests that there were fewer copies of Mark in circulation. Given that there are 12 ancient manuscripts of Matthew and only 1 of Mark, it is clear that Matthew was quite a bit more popular than Mark. This means that if Mark was an epitome of Matthew, it was a spectacularly unsuccessful one that did not, in the eyes of ancient readers, add significant value compared to its original. Indeed, as the number of surviving manuscripts suggests, they saw it as quite a bit less valuable than Matthew. On the other hand, if Mark wrote first and Matthew then produced an upgraded, expanded version of the same material, it makes sense why Matthew would have become popular and eclipsed Mark. We've seen a number of reasons to be skeptical of St. Augustine's proposal that Mark was the second gospel to be written and that it was an epitome of Matthew. Both of the arguments that Augustine proposes are reversible and can support either the view that Matthew used Mark or that Mark used Matthew. The idea that Matthew wouldn't use Mark because the latter was not an eyewitness is unconvincing. We have first-century evidence from John the Presbyter that Mark was based on the preaching of Peter rather than being based on Matthew's gospel, and Mark looks like the kind of Hupomnemata or unfinished note collection that Matthew would base a later finished work on. Matthew also is not long enough a work to need an epitome. It's just 1 scroll long. Mark is also not a major abridgment of Matthew. It's 62% as long as the proposed original. By regularly using more words rather than fewer to tell the same stories, Mark would have been doing the opposite of what ancient epitomizers did, and he would have been rejecting one of the key tools they used to make their abridgments. Much of the material Mark would have omitted seems to be more important than a lot of what he retained. The material that Mark would have added to Matthew seems much less important than the material he omitted. By adding so little value in terms of space saving and content, Mark would be badly designed and an unnecessary epitome, which went on to be quite unpopular. In view of these facts, Augustine's impression that Mark looks like Matthew's epitomizer is true only in a very superficial sense. A closer examination of the material suggests that Mark's gospel is not an epitome of Matthew. In his initial discussion of the matter, Augustine uses cautious language, only asserting that Mark looks like or seems like Matthew's epitomizer. He may have become less confident of the idea as he worked on his harmony of the Gospels, because there's a later passage that some scholars have taken to modify his initial view. After having worked through and carefully compared the 3 synoptics, Augustine makes this statement. Mark either appears to be preferentially the companion of Matthew, as he narrates a larger number of matters in unison with him than the rest, or else, in accordance with the more probable account of the matter, he holds a course in conjunction with both the other synoptics, Matthew and Luke. For although he is at one with Matthew in the larger number of passages, he is nevertheless at one rather with Luke in some others. Here, Augustine seems to make 2 proposals. The first seems to just be a restatement of the view he expressed at the beginning of the harmony, that Mark accompanies or is the companion of Matthew as he writes his gospel. The second acknowledges that as he writes his gospel, he holds course in conjunction with both Matthew and Luke, although he follows the first more than the second. This may mean that after his close comparison of the Gospels, Augustine had reason to modify his view of Mark as an apparent epitome of Matthew, and that he may have concluded that the more probable account of the matter was that Mark used both Matthew and Luke. This would be consistent with the modern Griesbach hypothesis, which holds that Matthew and Luke wrote first and then Mark combined them. Though we must be careful here because Augustine isn't fully clear in what he says. By speaking of Mark accompanying and holding a course with the other two synoptic evangelists, he may simply be noting the parallels in sequence that occur between them without supposing a particular theory of how they were composed. If so, he would have arrived at the insight that many moderns have proposed, that Mark is the middle term between Matthew and Luke. This, however, can be explained in more than one way. The Griesbach hypothesis is one proposal that makes Mark the middle term, but there are others. For example, if Mark wrote first and then was used by Matthew and Luke, he would still be the middle term between the two, as on the Farrar and Wilkie hypotheses. When it comes to what Augustine ultimately concluded, David Pearson, who wrote a key paper on this topic, commented, "The question of whether or not Augustine had two views of the order in which the Gospels were composed, just as he had two views of their mutual relationships, must remain open." Regardless of whether Augustine later changed his view of the order in which the Gospels were composed, his initial proposal that Mark was an epitome of the Gospel of Matthew appears to be simply mistaken. And this has implications for which view of the synoptic problem is ultimately correct. Although it's hypothetically possible to still hold that Mark fused Luke and Matthew on the Griesbach hypothesis, numerous problems that we've seen with the Augustinian hypothesis would plague it also. Mark is very unpolished in Greek compared to Matthew and Luke. It omits key things that you would expect a biography of Jesus to have, and that Matthew and Luke do have, like infancy narratives and resurrection appearances. Mark uses more words to tell the same stories that Matthew and Luke do, which is more explainable. If Mark wrote first and Matthew and Luke then told stories from Mark in fewer words so that they could fit more material into their Gospels. Mark would bizarrely leave out a ton of high-value material that's found in both Matthew and Luke. He would even more bizarrely add a handful of stories of much lower value, the kind of stories that Matthew and Luke could easily skip since they reduplicate other stories they were already including. And we have that first-century testimony from John the Presbyter, who was personally acquainted with authors of the New Testament and may have been an author of the New Testament himself, saying that Mark based his gospel on Peter's preaching, not on Matthew and Luke. All of this strongly suggests that Mark wrote first, that it was an unpolished first draft of a gospel that was later expanded and refined by Matthew and Luke, just as ancient authors did with Hupomnemata. We can discuss the Griesbach hypothesis more in future episodes, but based on what we've seen thus far, I have to conclude that the vast majority of modern scholars are correct in holding that Mark wrote first. I disagree with many and think it unlikely that there was a lost hypothetical Q source, and so I favor the Farrar and Wilkie hypotheses as more likely. In particular, I think that the Wilkie hypothesis has the best evidence in its favor, and we can talk about that too in future episodes, but I think that it's basically certain that Mark wrote first. If you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, sharing the podcast, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video. We're in our second year of the podcast now, and you can help me keep making this podcast for years into the future and get yourself early access to new episodes by going to patreon.com/Jimmy Akin Podcast. Thank you. I'll see you next time, and God bless you always.